So now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce a very dear friend, a brother to me, a mentor really in this space, Damon Hewitt. Damon Hewitt is the Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. He's been serving as a preeminent litigator and strategic leader with over 20 years of experience in the nonprofit, philanthropic, and public sectors. His career-long commitment to racial justice began as a Skadden Fellow at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, leading to pivotal roles such as the inaugural Executive Director of the Executive Alliance for Boys and Men of Color and a Senior Advisor to the Open Society Foundation. A graduate of Louisiana State University and the University of Pennsylvania Law School, he leverages his deep personal legal expertise and policy leadership to drive signature national achievements. From securing over $500 million in housing relief for Hurricane Katrina survivors to pioneering legal reforms for school-to-prison pipeline, Damon continues to drive systemic change as a leader of one of the nation's historic civil rights organizations, bridging the gap between high-stakes litigation and bold, accountable policy for the American public. So join me in welcoming Damon Hewitt.
I pay him a lot of money.
We got a time check. We're doing really good on time here. But our conversation today is going to focus primarily on political power and the road to 2026. We don't have any prepared questions or remarks. This is really just to be a conversation between two friends and two colleagues. What the hell went wrong in 2024?
Well, whatever went wrong in 2024 had already been going wrong. What went wrong is we had people who were hoodwinked, bamboozled, led astray, some of our own people in our own communities and families. We also had a system writ large that wasn't really working for us and our communities. And so that made people open to finding new pathways. I think we also made a mistake of assuming that what got us here would get us there in terms of strategy, policy. And then the last thing that we assumed perhaps was that the infrastructure of democracy would be sufficient, resilient. I mean, we all work hard, whether you're early career or whether you're more seasoned. And I believe we've made impact. But let's be honest. There's a large part of what we're doing that is coasting on the legacy of our ancestors. That's coasting on legislative infrastructure that's 60 plus years old. That doesn't make it wrong, but it means we have to actually now be builders for now and also for the future. So all the things that happened, the preconditions were already set. It reminds me of like one of these sci-fi movies where like, where did the aliens come from? I do not mean immigration. Just be clear. I'm talking about, foreign bodies, what have you, right? From outside the planet. Like Trump. It was recorded, damn, all right. But seriously, they said, where'd they come from? And then there was this realization, oh my goodness, they were already here the whole time. They were buried in the Earth's core or in the mantle or encapsulated in ice in Siberia. So the problems that we faced in 24 were already here.
Yeah. So, I get a lot of heat when I go to these conferences and speak because a lot of folks want to put the blame on Latino men, right? And we certainly saw a significant shift in the South and in the Southwest, even in Texas and the border region, where Trump was able to pick up another 5, 6, 7, and 8%. He did, to his credit, win more Latino votes than any president before him, right? And the big question was, were we lied to? Were we deceived? Did we all believe if he said he was going to cut our taxes and reduce inflation, that he also was going to deport 1 million immigrants? Because he said it, in our face, right? They had the banners and the signs at their convention, right? But most people didn't believe that one little phrase. And then come to pass, when he's out there trying to militarize our immigration system, we look pretty bad. We look pretty foolish. And so the question is, really, Damon, what does the Latino community have to learn from the black community? Because y'all have been out there organizing for decades, for generations, right? And we, as a community, lack the resources in many cases because most candidates and the political parties, to be very candid with you, including some of the presidential candidates, don't value our vote. They want our vote, right? But they'll give us a little bit of time, not their full attention. They'll allocate a little bit of resources, not all the money that they actually need to win in Florida and in Texas, for example. And this myth of, swing states is gone. Latinos can effectively swing any state in the country, because if it's a 3 or 5% margin in Minnesota, we can swing that, because Latinos make up 6 or 7% of that population. And in states like California or Arizona or Texas, where we over-index and are over 30% of the population, there's significant more impact than we can have. But what can Latinos do as a community? What can we do better? What can we learn from our brothers and sisters in the African American community?
Well, look, moment of humility for the community with which I identify. For every Latino who may have gone a certain way, I'll give you the best rapper alive, Lil Wayne. From my hometown of New Orleans, a black man who also went a certain way, right? So I'm not going to assume that black folks, that we have it down pat. What I will say is that we all have our unique forms of struggle and amazing traditions, culturally, politically, socially. I would say the legacy of chattel slavery in this country, unique to African Americans, people on this continent in particular, I would say that because of that legacy, there is a kind of a sense of remembrance, I won't call it a common ancestry, but a common reference point. And also the height of the American Civil Rights Movement in the 60s feels like another common reference point, not to certain generations, but for many generations. And I do think one of the things that we've learned along the way is essentially what Derek Bell and the godfather of critical race theory would call the permanence of racism. There have been scholars like Ian Haney Lopez and others who've written about proximity to and access to whiteness, which is something that some people in the Latino community may either experience or / enjoy. Very few black folks do, unless you're a passant blanche, unless you're passing for white, right? Like in my home state, Louisiana, there's certain people who, fit that bill. But because of the lack of that access, there isn't the same type of embrace. And so there's this notion, though, from critical race theory that racism may actually be a permanent fixture, certainly on the American landscape, if not the broader diasporic global landscape. That's not to be defeatist, that's to be realist. Because if Derek Bell taught us anything, is to act like you know. If that is the case, then we should act accordingly. One of the ways in which he teaches us to act accordingly is his theory of interest convergence. And essentially, if you're not familiar, it essentially means that the majority group, numerical majority, will only do things in the interest of the minority, numerical minority group, when it also serves the interests of the majority. And so you find a convergence of interests. And you can look at any number of historical examples. There are very few favors that have been done for our folks. Passage of civil rights legislation was not a favor. It took a lot of sweat, tears, and blood, but also there was such a moral clarity forced when some Americans, enough leaders, looked themselves in the mirror, they didn't want to see that. People think about Brown v. Board, the Supreme Court decision, which could have gone a different way, but the case was argued twice, most people don't know that, before it became a unanimous favorable ruling, there's literature written about how Brown was a Cold War imperative because the United States was being lambasted by its perceived opponents across the globe who said, hey, you claim we're communist and we're bad, you're an American Western democracy, but look, you hate your own people. And so Brown v. Boyd itself was a Cold War imperative. In the U.S. Civil War, right? They said the war was fought over slavery. You could say that, but it wasn't like, Abraham Lincoln was also have been known to write and say that if I could preserve the Union by freeing all the enslaved people, I will. If I could preserve the Union without freeing a single one, I'd do that too, right? So it's about the opportunities for convergence of interests, and I think that's the lesson. One, this country, the people who are in power are giving us nothing. Power will concede nothing without a demand, not to Frederick Douglass, but we can also identify the opportunities where interests may converge to leverage and gain power. Not power over, but at least power within.
Yeah, and there's a lot more that connects our communities than most folks understand, From a socioeconomic perspective, key indicators in regards to home ownership, for example, hasn't really changed in the last 50 years. We celebrate the fact that, we're at 52% or 53% Latino home ownership, and it's the highest it's ever been, but we don't necessarily focus on the fact that the gap has actually increased because white home ownership has actually gone even higher than that, significantly. In areas of education, access to health care, right? And the issues that our young youth have relative to education, English language learning, which we have fought for generations and fought state fights like the Florida consent decree that LULAC was so important in winning in the state of Florida. And so there's so much more that actually binds us together. But the challenge that we have as a Latino community is our own perspective among each other. And I said it before, Latinos can be racist too, right? And we have to acknowledge that truth. So, Mexican Americans make up 58% of the Latino population in the United States. By far the overwhelming majority. The only other Latino community that comes even closer, Puerto Ricans, which make up 12% of the Latino population. But after that, it's a pretty steep drop. There's like 1% Peruanos, 1% Colombianos, 1% Bolivianos, if you will, right? But we have to be conscious of that. We have to be conscious of that bias because one of the key differences is that the Black community moves in unison, in lockstep. And we as Latinos continue to argue amongst ourselves. And that is a huge impediment to our own progress as a community, both political, as we seek political power, right? But from an advocacy perspective at a state and local level. And so we need to do better in that regard. One of the things, look, this is a very small community. We've got Damon, who's brilliant, and Maya Wiley at the Leadership Conference, and Mark Morial, and Derek Johnson. Derek is always talking to me about, the nonprofit industrial complex, right? And the allocation of resources or lack of resources that are allocated to minority nonprofit organizations or minority-serving nonprofit organizations. And that's a really big issue in our community. But while we are being distracted on issues of immigration, on issues of Medicare and Medicaid and health, while we're being distracted on the issues of voting rights and all these executive orders that are coming out, what the Trump administration is doing is that they are adjusting all the levels of power, all the levels of economic power to enrich themselves, while we're over here kind of sort of focus on these other fires that we effectively have to fight. So what has the Lawyers Committee been doing on that front?
So there's pathways to scratch and scrimp and make a living wage, and I credit those efforts over the last decade and a half or so, or 20 years, to fight for 15, to have a higher living wage. Of course, that doesn't do a lot for people these days, as much as it would have a decade ago with dramatic inflation. But then there's also this notion of, and it kind of goes to something that Nira Tandon talked about, because when she was talking about immigration, she talked about there's a story of belonging, who belongs and who doesn't. There's also a story about these kind of normative notions of who's deserving, who has merit, as much as it is about who belongs. And when you think about economic piece, people think about economic opportunity as a mythical thing. I can almost envision a ladder of upward mobility, but it's got Vaseline all over it. And you're wearing socks, not grippy shoes. And it's, 10 degrees outside. So good luck climbing that ladder or even holding on to the rung where you are, right? So, but when I think about what we deserve, and we actually had this campaign a couple years ago for our 60th anniversary at the Lawyers Committee that we called The Future We Deserve. And so I would give these talks, and I would invite people in the room, and maybe we'll do it right now, to just, if you feel comfortable, close your eyes, and think about all the things that you want for yourself, for your family, for your friends, for your community. There's safety, there's health, but maybe there's also wealth. Not just having a job, but having a fulfilling career and the opportunity to build intergenerational wealth that you can transfer to your children as a legacy and your grandchildren and whatnot. So open your eyes. So all the things you may have thought about in those few seconds, shouldn't just be wishes. That should be what you deserve. And so I do think that the mindset when it comes to the economic piece shouldn't be this meta-narrative of, well, people say the rich get richer, poor get poor, what have you, as if it's naturally occurring. It is in this economy and society occurring, but it doesn't make it natural. We all deserve to have wealth and abundance as much as we want, right? As much as our dreams. And we're told about the American dream, not just having a house and a picket fence, but the dream of capitalism, right? That you can, if you work hard enough and you're smart enough, meaning if you have the right connections and your skin tone is right, and the doors aren't slammed in your face, and if you're not slammed to the ground by police or ICE or CBP, that's what they should be telling us, right? That you can have opportunity too. But I think it starts with this notion that we deserve prosperity in all ways, in all forms. And it's very much likely the case that I know it's the case that the opportunities that we're locked out of experiencing and having block the potential for that prosperity. So what is the Lawyers Committee doing? We have to work at multiple levels. One is, this whole swath of anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion rhetoric and the executive orders from the White House. Those are designed to block access to opportunity. Remember, one of the first big cases in that realm was a case against a group called the Fearless Fund. This is a venture capital outfit based in Atlanta that focuses on the fact that black women have access to far less than 1% of all venture capital in the country. It's probably, I forget the exact number, but it's way less than 1%. And so their intervention was to give micro grants to black women entrepreneurs. These are like $20,000 grants. Now I don't have $20,000 in my pocket right now, so it's a good bit of money, but it's not venture money because you need many millions for venture capital. And so Ed Blum, the same guy who created the fake organization Students for Fair Admissions, the same guy who said Harvard and UNC Chapel Hill discriminate against Asian American students, and the same guy whose lawyers put up 0 Asian American clients to testify at any of these trials, because we litigated the trials, Juan, at the Lawyers Committee at Harvard, and we litigated these cases for 9 years and argued it in the Supreme Court. Our lawyer at the time, David Hinojosa, argued in the Supreme Court. The same guy created another set of organizations that went after the Fearless Fund. So that was one of their first big attacks. They're attacking our access to capital. But they're also attacking us from the other end. The anti-DEI executive orders had a chilling effect on groups like our client that we share in common with Latino Justice, formerly known as PRODEF, and National Women's Law Center, and a couple of other groups. Our client called Chicago Women in Trades. This is an organization based in Chicago, but with the national model that trains primarily Latina and Black women to get high-paying jobs in the trades, like carpentry, welding, what have you. You don't need fancy degrees, and you can make six figures if you get one of those union jobs, right? They told that group, cease all equity-related activity and threaten to terminate their Department of Labor grant. Everything they do is equity. So my point is, they're coming at us from, and we filed a lawsuit, and we got a quick temporary restraining order, and then a preliminary injunction, and every time the government lawyers appear in court, the judges in the district court and the Court of Appeals blast them because they keep talking about illegal DEI, but they can't define what that is because they made it up. So my point is that what we're doing at the Lawyers Committee, what we all have to do is focus on opportunity for those who don't have the kind of pedigree, degreed opportunities, but also on the prosperity front when it comes to things like Fearless Fund as well. We have to work both of those angles so that we can enjoy whatever abundance our people want and deserve.
And as LULAC has had a very long history litigating civil rights for Latino community, we can't do it without Damon's leadership and the leaders and the Lawyers Committee. And so I want to thank you really from the bottom of my heart for the incredible work that you all do.
Thank you for your partnership.
And the partnership. So the question is, I know that the Latino community is resilient, right? I see it in each of your faces. The fact that you all are here with us today is a testament to that. That we're going to continue to fight back, and that this administration actually has an expiration date. And we know on January 20th, 2029, we're going to be swearing in a brand new president, right? So what can we do in the interim in 2026, right? And what is potentially at stake here?
I'm going to quote, I won't name the name, but there's a federal judge. I was talking to him once a couple of decades ago, complaining about judges who, they just throw their power around. And he's a fairly progressive, jurist. And he said, what good is power if you don't use it? It atrophies and dies. If you don't use your muscles physically in your body, they atrophy too. If you don't keep your mind sharp, it atrophies. If we don't practice solidarity and connectivity, those connections will atrophy. So one of the most important things we can do to prepare for the future we deserve, which is hopefully a little three years away to start with, is to identify, know our physical and metaphysical bodies, metaphorical bodies, to identify those muscles and flex them and work them. So if you're going to the gym, you may have a cardio routine or a leg day, as they say, or an arm day. We need the same thing when it comes to our exercise of our political power, right? We can't do all things at one time, but we can pull together different muscles together across groups of people, metaphysical, metaphorical muscles, and create a strong body. So that means being ready to have policy solutions, not at day one, but day zero, day -1. We need policy solutions that aren't just ideas, but things that are immediately actionable. We need a new plan to rebuild the infrastructure that has been weakened and dismantled. I don't think that we can build it back exactly as it was, because there are ways in which it worked for us and ways in which it didn't, but we also don't have the time. We can't replace all civil rights infrastructure in every federal agency in one president, maybe in one presidential term, but you'll be 3.5 years in by the time you get everybody confirmed by a Senate that probably won't be favorable, by the time you get all the other appointees. And just think, the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice has been cleared out of almost anyone who is a legitimate civil rights lawyer. I don't just mean who believes in my ideas of philosophy. I mean just in terms of talent and skill and knowledge. Do you know what the heck you're doing? I'm not trying to malign any lawyers, but they're not. The group right now isn't exactly lighting it up in the courts, right? From DOJ on any front, right? So we have to have a new approach to what rebuilding looks like. We're also going to have people. It's going to hurt organizations like ours. It's going to be brain drain. We need people willing and ready to serve inside government because there's certainly not enough of that. There's not enough of that. There are so many good people who have come to our organizations who served at DOJ, at CFPB, at Department of Education, at EEOC, at Federal Trade Commission. Those are the ones that we've hired, I know. And other groups have hired probably even more. So we need people who are ready to answer the call to service in the early career ranks, in the senior ranks, even people who thought they were retired to come back into service. We're going to need all of that. We also are going to have to consider our relationship to power. We're a nonpartisan organization at the Lawyers Committee. We don't even have a C4, right? So everything I say is C3 friendly, right? Right. So we have to, when I talk about power, it atrophies and dies, but the only thing worse than power atrophying and dying is not even knowing you have it in the first place, right? So we have to reconsider what we're willing to do, how far we're willing to go. We always have this kind of patina of reasonableness. And a lot of our civil rights and advocacy work. Maybe we have to be a little less reasonable. You know, slave abolitionists weren't reasonable, right? They say, no, in this madness now, period. So, and Dr. King was told he wasn't reasonable. And then he wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail. And so these people who were told they were unreasonable, even by people within their own in-groups, right? They were able to introduce a sharpness of moral clarity that was not easy but hard-won, but a moral clarity that wasn't like the ends justify the means, but a moral clarity that pushed the bounds of what people think was possible, feasible, and doable, or at least what people were willing to try, right? Mass civil disobedience of the likes that this country had never seen before. So we're going to have to push that envelope and reassess our own relationship with power individually and collectively.
Yeah. It's, I was a couple of weeks ago in a coffee shop here in DC meeting with a dear friend and colleague. And, it only you sit on TV and people have these conversations in coffee shops, right? And then something incredible happens. And she's like, I'm building a plan to rebuild the DOJ. And I was like, all right, someone's thinking about that. Someone is actively thinking about it, working on it, has the funding to execute it, right? And I was like, I can breathe. Because there are a coalition of leaders, of organizations that are out there that are trying to put together their version of a Project 2025, which was what the Trump administration and his colleagues had introduced, which have effectively gotten us to where we are today. And we need our own plan. But planning comes from strategy, it comes from experience and expertise, and having some of the best thinkers, new, young, and those that are most experienced in this space in order to impact change. But let's talk a little bit about the actual tactical elements of what happens in 2026. And we are bipartisan. This is a C4 event, but LULAC is a bipartisan organization, but we're also a political organization, and let's not forget that. We're a political organization. And each of you as members, right, can advocate and support for whoever you want in office. Because one of the most direct ways to Latino power is to get more Latinos elected, like Representative Ramirez, right? Who is an incredibly strong advocate and on the oversight of DHS. So let's focus on that. If we win back the House, just the House, not the Senate, if Hakeem Jeffries becomes the leader of the House, then we all of a sudden gain back the power of the purse string, right? We can go back through reconciliation and claw back the funding that DHS has. And the oversight committees that are minority Democratic become majority Democratic, and then we set the schedule. We set the hearings, and we push for accountability in the halls of the White House and in Congress as well. And those are real stakes that we have. And there is the potential for us to have an impact and win. And that's why LULAC filed suit and intervened on Prop 50 in California to get us an extra 5 seats and to level the playing field on a partisan basis, not on a racial gerrymander, which is what they tried to basically do in Texas. And that's why LULAC and the work that it is doing is so important. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Calais v. Landry. Can you explain to our attendees what that is?
So Calais, the story of Calais probably starts decades ago, but more recently with a case called Robinson that our friends at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, LDF, litigated. That was one of a number of cases that groups like ours, us, the Lawyers Committee, LDF, others, litigated around the country following every decennial census when there's reapportionment happening and redistricting happening. And so the argument in Robinson was that, hey, Louisiana is shortchanging black population, just like Texas shortchanged black and brown population. Texas had one of the most, probably the most dramatic increases in population in the country, most of it black and brown. Yet, when they start to create the congressional districts and often state legislative districts, you would never know because there are not as many majority-minority districts, as they say in legal parlance, as you would expect. So LDF litigated the Robinson case and won the case. And so then Louisiana says, we're going to create a new district. They create a second majority black district. There's now a second African-American member of Congress. So then some folks, probably in collusion with Louisiana state officials, the white folks decide, well, we're going to sue because creating that district violated our rights, they said. Their logic is as follows. Well, you tell a Supreme Court that race shouldn't predominate in redistricting or in anything. And so when the court told Louisiana you had to create a second black district, race predominated. Therefore, that is unconstitutional, even if it was designed to correct the underlying legal violation, which was a violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Essentially, they're saying effective race-specific remedies to violations of civil rights are themselves unconstitutional. So wash your hands of it. You can't essentially enforce the Voting Rights Act, that part of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And so it is really a dastardly argument. It's one that the Alabama Solicitor General, I believe, tried to lift up in a prior case called Merrill a few years ago that Alabama lost. And so it's the kind of argument that if the court rules the wrong way, we will be left with rights on paper, but no race-conscious, rights on paper on civil rights violations, but no race-conscious remedy in fact. That essentially every intervention has to be race-neutral. So if you're discriminated against because of your race, they're saying that you can't address it as such. You have to almost pretend like it wasn't about race, which is really bogus. But there's another couple of cases I want to mention very quickly. One that we are litigating at the Lawyers Committee out of Mississippi. We represented the state NAACP in the case regarding state redistricting. We won that case as well. A 3-judge panel found that the state was diluting black voting strength. After we won the case, and after 3 black members of the state Senate were elected, which actually broke a Republican supermajority in Mississippi for the first time in years, not ironically, Mississippi then came back and said, well, you didn't really have a right to sue in the first place. You didn't have what they call a private right of action. So for decades, it's been understood that regular residents, voters, and groups like ours on their behalf have the right to sue to vindicate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So if that case and a somewhat similar case out of North Dakota called Turtle Mountain regarding Native communities, if those go south and the Calais case goes south, you will literally have rights on paper, no remedy in fact, and no access to the courts to vindicate your rights. And the only entity that can vindicate those rights is the U.S. Department of Justice. Can't count on them right now.
And so that ruling is going to come down pretty soon, we expect, right? We expect. Janae Nelson actually litigated that for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and an incredible advocate for our community. But I'm going to break it down a little bit further, right? We hear all about these cases of redistricting and gerrymandering effectively across the country. Well, they're now going to have effectively a legal pathway in order to do that in every state. And while it will, in the immediate term, potentially risk upwards of 19 congressional seats currently held by African American leaders, it will have long-term implications for Latinos in states like Florida, Texas, California, Arizona, New Mexico, which actually have large Latino populations as well. And the only thing that will continue to stand in Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is the Spanish ballots that are now also required vis-a-vis that amendment as well. Yeah. And so there is a lot at stake. There's a lot at risk for our democracy. And it's wonderful to have brilliant friends like Damon that are thinking about this stuff, because it can get pretty complicated pretty quick, you know. And if you're not a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer.
You play one on TV.
Play one on TV. We have great legal advisors that we can effectively count on, and great partners which we work very closely with on. And so, you know, I want each of you to kind of sort of consider what happens essentially down the line, you know. And all of this can be prevented, or can certainly make a difference. And that one thing you can do is vote, is get fair representation for the issues that you care about in your community. And vote in the midterms, and vote in the special elections, and vote in the primaries, and vote in the general elections every 4 years. We can have a direct impact on our country, on the state of our politics, if you will, and at a baseline for the benefit of your family and your community and other people of like mind and interest, not just Latinos, right? Living in some of the worst conditions at times, some of the most unequitable, if you will, and flat out, quite frankly, in some of the most racially divided communities in this country. So
I'd like just a quick personal privilege, two things. One, I want to recognize my colleague Chaz Robinson, who's in the audience. Raise your hand, Chaz. Raise it high, brother. So Chaz is one of our policy counsel at the Lawyers Committee who partners. His specific expertise is on education issues as a policy advisor, but he can cut across issues as we all have to. But I also just want to take a moment to recognize LULAC. You know, we talked about these voting rights cases, but in the Texas case, LULAC, represented by Malduff, was the first to file in that case. You're involved in so much, that Prop 50 in California, so much leading edge litigation. So, brother, you are not a lawyer, but you definitely play one on TV, because you and your leadership are there when Latinos need you. You're there when America needs you. So thank you so much, LULAC, for what you do.
Thank you. And I think yesterday we joined in an amicus brief on the FTC case, and so the lawyer committee is representing us on that. So, Damon, thank you so much for your friendship. Thank you so much for your leadership. Thank you for coming out and joining us today.
Of course,